So I am actually on record as saying that I do believe BlackRock will file for both spot XRP and Solana ETFs, though we're getting a little bit late here in the sense of, I think, again, we're getting closer to the finish line and they still haven't filed. Now, maybe
This episode is brought to you by Uphold, which is a great crypto platform that makes it easy to buy, sell, and stake crypto assets. Uphold has over 300 plus cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin and all the top altcoins, and they offer a crypto staking on over 19 crypto assets. I've been a user of the platform for many years. They are safe and reliable. They don't commingle or lend out your crypto funds, and they are 100% reserved. You can review their transparency report. Uphold also offers an amazing rewards program where you can earn up to 5.25% on stablecoins. This rewards program also allows you to get 24-hour early access to new tokens that they list. And to participate, you just simply have to open the app once per month, deposit $50 once per month, and trade $50 once per month. And the stablecoins that they support includes Ripple's RLUSD. You can earn up to 5% on that stablecoin and 5.25% on USBC. So if you'd like to learn more about Uphold and all the great services they offer, visit the link in the description. Hey folks, welcome into the Thinking Crypto podcast. I'm your host, Tony Edward, and joining me today is Nate Geraci, who is the president of NovaDius Wealth Management, which is formerly the ETF store, and also the co-founder of the ETF Institute. Nate, great to see you.
it is so good to be back here. I feel like we have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. Nate, there's been quite a few updates, very important ones from the SEC as it relates to crypto ETPs. Let's kick it off with the SEC approving in-kind creations and redemptions for crypto ETFs. What does this mean for the market, and what type of impact should we see from that?
Well, first of all, Tony, I have to mention, I think this took way too long to happen. My sense was that ETF issuers were ready to handle this from day one last January when spot Bitcoin ETFs first launched. But of course, the Gensler-led SEC wouldn't allow in-kind creations and redemptions at that time. And so I think the first easy takeaway here is this does show the continued progress we're seeing around crypto ETFs overall, right? It's yet another step forward. And I do think it's nice to see a regulator who is making decisions that benefit investors, and they're not necessarily making decisions out of spite or politics or whatever it was that we saw over the past 4 years ago. So I think that's the easy takeaway. In terms of what this means for the ETFs themselves, basically, this will allow them to run a little bit more efficiently. So you might see things like tighter trading spreads, tighter bid asks. These ETFs might track the price of Bitcoin a little bit more closely, those sorts of things. But this isn't going to be hugely noticeable to investors, only because these ETFs were already operating very efficiently. But I will say, overall, still helpful. It does make the entire process of creating and redeeming shares smoother. So it is better for everyone, I would say, including the ETF issuers. The way to think about this is it just wrings a little bit of cost out of the system.
And just to confirm, for myself and the folks who are new to the ETF world, so let's say I hold the Bitcoin and the Ethereum spot ETFs. I want to redeem. I can get the actual assets themselves, right? Not cash.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned this, because that's actually a misconception that's out there. And without getting too far into the weeds of how ETFs work, ETF creations and redemptions, these are done by large financial institutions, institutions like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. So this is not something that everyday investors can do. This is handled by those large institutions, and it's handled in bulk size. Now, we may get an ETF at some point in the future that does allow direct in-kind creations and redemptions for the average everyday investor, but that is not what this approval is. And I'll tell you, it's the same. I always like to compare it to the physical gold ETF category. So it's the same with physical gold ETFs, but you might appreciate there is actually a physical gold ETF that allows uh, everyday investors to directly redeem shares for physical gold bars. And so I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, again, we don't see an ETF issuer or two or three attempt to file for something like that. But as it pertains to this recent approval by the SEC, again, this is not something that individual investors can do on their own.
Got it. And then it sounds like the market has been waiting for this, the institutional investors who have been launching these products. So I'm assuming many of them are going to hit the ground running, BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, Fidelity, and much more.
Yeah, the issuers are all ready for this. The authorized participants, the APs who I mentioned who handle this, they're all ready for this. So that's why operationally, the end investor is not going to notice anything different. Again, they may see slightly better spreads, may track the price of Bitcoin or Ether a little bit more closely, but other than that, it's just business as usual.
Yeah. So I wonder why it took so long, but maybe it's kind of the legacy spillover from Gensler, and now that Paul Atkins is, in office and he's situated and he's now getting to all of these things.
Yeah, they just didn't want some of these financial institutions actually handling Bitcoin and transacting in Bitcoin. And so they put the onus onto the ETF issuer to go out into the marketplace and secure the Bitcoin. It really, if you boil it down, it's that simple.
Now, the SEC recently has been delaying some launches of ETFs. So they approve like the Grayscale conversion, a large cap, and then some others as well, but they haven't allowed it to launch. Do you have any insights there as to why? Could it be they're waiting on legislation?
Okay, so I have several thoughts on this. And just to add some context, so the SEC Division of Trading and Markets, they approved two ETFs. One was the Grayscale Digital Large Cap ETF, and the other was the Bitwise 10 Crypto Index ETF. And to be clear, both of these would be what are called conversions or uplistings. So those funds already exist in the marketplace. They're just not ETFs. And so what they filed for was to effectively turn these into the ETF structure. So these were both approved by the SEC Division of Trading and Markets. And then that approval was stayed by the SEC. And that just means that that approval order was paused or suspended. And I think that there's a fairly sizable camp of people that believe the reason for that is the SEC simply wants to have a broad framework put in place to bring spot crypto ETFs to market before allowing ETFs that own anything other than Bitcoin and Ether. And actually last week, and we can talk about this, you may have seen this, the three major exchanges, so NYSE, NASDAQ, and CBOE, they all filed for generic listing standards for spot crypto ETFs. And so all of that is to say, it's very possible that the SEC, with the Grayscale and Bitwise ETFs, they didn't want to deny these outright because they want to show that they're being forward thinking and crypto friendly, but they also didn't want those ETFs to launch until that framework that I just mentioned is in place. So that's sort of one theory or one line of thinking. And if that's the case, great. Now, the other line of thinking, and if I'm being honest, it's the one that I actually subscribe to, is any one SEC commissioner has the ability to hold up the show here. And the reason for that is because these ETFs were approved under what's called delegated authority. And all that means is that the SEC staff, the staff, not the commissioners, made the decision. So there wasn't a vote among the SEC commissioners. But any one commissioner can come in after the fact and basically throw a wrench in the process. And I don't like to pick on anybody. There's one commissioner in particular who you're probably aware of who it is, who has been very publicly anti-crypto, and that's Commissioner Crenshaw. And so the thought is that she's holding this up simply because she can, or at least she thinks she can. Now, let me just briefly add a little more context to even that. So both of these ETFs, they follow the the regulatory process perfectly, right? So they did everything that they were supposed to do, and then they were approved after 240 days. And so there's actually now a little bit of debate over whether Commissioner Crenshaw even has the power to come in after the fact, after the approval order was issued, and hold up the show. And I agree with that. I'm not sure that she does have the power to do that. And I'm not a lawyer, Tony, but my guess is if Grayscale and Bitwise lawyers wanted to, I think they would have a very strong argument to fight this. And actually, you may remember it was 2, 3 weeks ago, Grayscale's lawyers, they sent what I would say was a fairly terse letter to the SEC on this. And it said something to the effect of this being an improper end around the framework that was established by Congress. In other words, they were saying Commissioner Crenshaw or whoever it was should not have the ability to do this after the SEC already issued the approval order. Now, in terms of Bitwise and Grayscale getting their attorneys involved and really fighting this, it probably doesn't make that much sense at this point because I'm assuming these ETFs are going to be approved in fairly short order anyways. But it just kind of shows you there's still some of that legacy thinking or feeling, that negative feeling around crypto that still exists within the SEC. So hopefully that all made sense. It's kind of an interesting story, though.
Nate, that's very insightful. I didn't even know about that, the Crenshaw aspect, that she could throw a monkey wrench into the whole system. And I think a lot of people looking from the outside are like, what's going on? Why the delay? Why the approval, but not the go ahead to list? And that doesn't make sense. And then I think about last week where Paul Atkins talked about Project Crypto and they're looking to give more clarity. Maybe it's all of this is going to culminate the timeline, further guidance from the SEC to get all these things live.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider here, just as it pertains to a commissioner throwing a wrench in the process, is keep in mind what we just talked about in terms of the SEC approving in-kind creations and redemptions. And they actually recently bumped up the position limits on the iShares Bitcoin ETF for options trading, those sorts of things. You would think that if they wanted to wait and have a framework in place, that they wouldn't approve these other items. And so that's why it leads me to believe that maybe a commissioner did get involved and throw a wrench in the process. But I think to what you were alluding to a little bit, this SEC, no doubt, I think they're much more crypto friendly. We know that. And I think they're going to continue to be much more crypto friendly moving forward. But this still isn't a great look for the SEC because it's making people like me and you have to try to figure out what's going on, right? Versus just be transparent and explain what's happening here. I just don't think that when the average investor sees, okay, well, these were approved, and then wait, you mean they're not approved? The order state, like, help me understand. It just doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence around how the process is going. And so I think optically, it's a bad look. Again, I think where we're heading is to a very positive spot. And so maybe this is just some of that legacy thinking that's carried over.
Yeah, definitely. Personally, I was thinking, look, we already have clarity on Bitcoin and ETH. There's already spot ETFs that exist. But when you add the basket where you have XRP, Solana, Cardano, whatever else, right? There's not so much clarity there. Not saying that they are securities. I'm just saying that the SEC has not come out formally and said, hey, these are good to go. And that were they waiting for the market structure bill to get passed and then they piggyback on that. But then the deadline's in October, so they're cutting it close here. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and let me just add a quick point on that. The problem that I have with that, Tony, is that if you look right now, you can buy leveraged futures-based XRP and Solana ETFs. And so take the Grayscale Digital Large Cap ETF. It's going to own more than 85% in Bitcoin and Ether because those are the two largest cryptos. And so it has a smaller allocation to XRP and Solana, and I think it's Cardano. But you can already buy those futures-based leveraged out there. And so it just shows you there's still some of these contradictions. The other thing, this gets a little in the weeds on the ETF side, but I think it's worth pointing out, is that earlier this year, the SEC allowed ETFs to own private assets.
Mm.
And the way that that's set up is that they can own up to 15% in, say, private credit. And State Street's trying to get creative to own more than that. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you have an ETF where you can own up to 15% in a liquid private assets, then what's the difference if you have an ETF that owns, say, Bitcoin and Ether over 85% that the SEC has already approved, and then let's just call the other 15% illiquid assets, which I would dispute that. I don't think XRP is a liquid or Solana is a liquid, but you get my point. Let's just assume that it is. What's the difference here? So again, it's just these inconsistencies or contradictions that still exist. Again, I think they're getting resolved, but we're just in that sort of crossover period right now.
And to that point, the other thing I was thinking about personally was historically, the SEC has gone the route of we need to see a futures market set up for Bitcoin and ETH before we approve the spot. Most recently, I think a month ago or more, XRP and Solana ETFs went live on the CME and in other platforms as well. Do you think part of it is that too, they want to have some space between the futures being launched and then going live with the spot?
That may be part of it, but that also gets into the generic listing standards and this crypto framework I'm talking about. Because if you look at that, it's basically saying something to the effect if you have regulated futures contracts trading on a particular crypto assets, and maybe there's a 6-month period, I can't remember exactly what it is, then that would be part of the framework to then allow the spot crypto ETF to come to market if there is an underlying futures contract, again, trading on a regulated exchange. So again, I think all of this stuff sort of ties together. And I'll just reiterate, I do think we're closer to the finish line on a lot of this than we are the starting line.
Yeah, for sure. It's just a matter of a couple months almost, right? At the deadline in October. So sooner than later, we're going to see
I
that.
thought this was going to be the crypto ETF summer, and it's now looking more like crypto ETF fall.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's talk about inflows for Bitcoin and ETH ETFs, spot ETFs. We've seen some incredible numbers in July. Obviously, there's going to be your healthy rebalance of outflows, but the volume, the amount of money coming in has been growing. What are your thoughts on this and how it's outperforming traditional TradFi ETFs, if you want to call them that?
Well, just to add some numbers around that, so year to date, spot Bitcoin ETFs have seen about $20 billion in inflows, and spot Ether ETFs have taken in around $7 billion. And what's amazing about the spot Ether ETFs is that up until last week, they had a 20-day inflow streak going, took in new money every day for 20 days. And just in that streak, they took in over $5 billion in new money. And combined, so if you look at both Bitcoin and Ether ETFs together, it was a record month for spot crypto ETFs. We may have talked about this before. What's amazing to me about this as we sit here today is there's still limited access out there. So in other words, there's a lot of larger advisory platforms, wirehouses, where their advisors don't have full access to be able to recommend these products to end clients. Of course, Vanguard famously
Yeah.
still doesn't allow them on their brokerage platform. And here we are, you look at the numbers that these are putting up, it's unbelievable. It's like they're doing it with one hand tied behind their back. So I still think that we're very early here. I think that I'll speak from an advisor perspective. If you go and talk to advisors, they're certainly warming up to Bitcoin. I think they're warming up to Ether. But Tony, there's still a long way to go on education. Advisors are very diligent about what goes in the portfolio, as they should be, and they really have to understand an asset. They have to believe it's going to add value, and they have to be able to explain it to their end clients. And so I still think that a lot of that education is happening. We're still early in that.
Wow. It's pretty incredible that, to your point, we're still early, but the inflows have been just massive. So I'm curious, on your front, anecdotally, are you seeing more demand from your clients? Are they asking about crypto, given that crypto is going more mainstream, legislation's getting passed and things like that?
There's no question, because if you look at what is in the headlines now, to your point, you pick up any mainstream media publication or go to their website, you're probably going to come across some discussion, some articles around crypto. And so you do have a situation where as more mainstream investors hear about it, they're going to start asking questions about it. And that's why I've always said from day one, if you're an advisor out there, regardless of whether or not you want to own crypto in a portfolio, you better be able to talk about it
Yeah.
because your clients are going to ask questions on it. So yeah, I think that's helped. And at some point too, Tony, think about we had the Genius Act, uh, recently signed into law, right? Stablecoin legislation, which I think is from that for just high level that looks very bullish for Ether. And so if you kind of connect those dots, those sorts of things are going to have clients and investors going, okay, well, I understand that the Genius Act is going to help stablecoins. Stablecoins are tied to Ether and so on. Like, help me understand all the connections there. And so, that's going on now, where you have people trying to connect the dots on everything happening in crypto. So again, I know I'm a broken record. I just think put any sort of price predictions aside where you think we're at on price. I think we're still early in just the overall adoption here and the overall education.
Yeah, and when you think about like the S curve adoption, just even historically, I remember I was talking to Congressman French Hill about it when they passed the telecommunications bill in 1996. Still had another 4 year run where Google and Amazon, all these companies started growing. And yes, you had your dot-com bubble burst, but it took a while for all these things to be built out. So if we were to align some of the timeline here, you're now getting legislation. So the runway has to be cleared by the legislation for these folks to innovate and build. So there's still so much to be done.
There is. And again, it gets back into what we were just talking about, even on the crypto ETF side, where we have these major exchanges trying to put in a framework to allow additional spot crypto ETFs to launch. So how does the general public feel when we have an XRP ETF and a Solana ETF? And you start going down the line, we're going to have index-based crypto ETFs. All of that, too, is just going to help in this awareness of mainstream around crypto. That's why I've always called ETFs bridges between TradFi and DeFi. I know I've told you that before because it's a way for TradFi investors, I'm using that in air quotes, to sort of get comfortable with crypto and learn about it. It's like crypto with training wheels.
Mm.
And at some point, they start moving across that bridge to where perhaps they'll be interacting directly in the crypto ecosystem versus through a TradFi wrapper.
Oh, absolutely. Now, going back really quick to Ethereum, you mentioned like the stablecoin bill being positive for ETH because obviously a lot of stablecoins are built on ETH and ETH layer twos, right? But the yield, the staking component, still missing from those ETFs. Do you think once that's approved, we could see a surge in inflows into the Ethereum ETFs? And do you think that might be approved within the same timeline as the spot ETFs for the other altcoins?
I definitely think it will help because that right now is yield. Even though the yield overall is pretty small, that's still return that you could have that you cannot achieve or you cannot access through an ETF wrapper. And so once you have that, I think that will certainly help. In terms of approval, yeah, I actually think that this is the next item on the SEC's checklist. I expect them to approve this before we see any other approvals in the crypto ETF space. And they actually recently acknowledged the iShares Ethereum ETF. They have a filing, right, to add staking. The SEC acknowledged that. And so sort of what I was talking about with the in-kind creations of redemptions, this is a pretty easy item to cross off the checklist because staking is something that ETF issuers, they could have handled last July when these launched. And so the issuers are ready to go.
Mm.
And the other thing is that you may have seen there's now a Solana ETF that has a staking component that actually is live in the marketplace. And I definitely won't get into the details of all that. It used a very unique structure, sort of an end around to come to market. But that same issuer, they have an Ether version, which I think they can launch any day. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure they can bring it to market if they want. And the point of that is that I don't know that the SEC likes the idea of these other ETFs being in the marketplace that offer staking, where it's not the traditional what's called 33 Act structure that all the spot crypto ETFs operate under. I don't think the SEC necessarily likes having those products in the marketplace when they haven't approved staking for everyone. And so again, I just feel like this is an easy item for the SEC to cross off the list. And as you know, the SEC has already said that staking on ETH, that's not a security. Issuers are ready to handle this. So there's really no reason to continue delaying it. And I don't think the SEC will.
Yeah, to your point, with that Solana ETF, I think they did it via C Corp or something like that, some kind of structure.
Yeah, I mean, they used a 40 Act structure. There's a Cayman subsidiary. Yeah, it gets a little complex. And the ETF works exactly the way it's supposed to. It's fine. It's exactly what you get. There is some items to be aware of around taxation. But, I think the optics of that, again, where the SEC, basically, they couldn't stop that from coming to market. And they're still working through some of these other issues. Again, it's optics, Tony, kind of what I was talking about before, right? I just don't think the SEC likes the optics of that, even though they've created some bad optics on their own. There's just no reason to continue delaying allowing staking in spot Ether ETFs. It's, again, in my opinion, a very easy thing for them to approve. And I think that's what they will do.
In addition to this other ETF route, which they don't necessarily want out there, you have publicly traded companies are adding Ether to their treasury, and
That's a great
they're
point.
taking the staking yield, and they could pay out as dividends or reinvest it. So, like, why would you not have it in the ETF? Like, what's the holdup?
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I wanted to ask you, this is a bit speculative, but we've seen BlackRock. They've jumped in, and behind these ETFs. Folks are curious, are they going to file for XRP Solana ETF? Do you think they're going to do it, or are they going to wait?
So I am actually on record as saying that I do believe BlackRock will file for both spot XRP and Solana ETFs, though we're getting a little bit late here in the sense of, I think, again, we're getting closer to the finish line and they still haven't filed. Now, maybe they're waiting for that formal framework that we talked about to be put into place, and they're going to swoop in at the last minute and file for these. But here's how I would describe this. BlackRock right now is the clear leader in crypto ETFs. They have the largest Bitcoin ETF by far. They have the largest Ether ETF. BlackRock, historically, if you look on the stock side of the equation and the bond side of the equation, they are definitely proponents of an index-based approach to the markets, right? In other words, they would, one of their biggest ETFs is an S&P 500 ETF or an aggregate bond ETF. They believe that indexing is an appropriate way to access different asset classes. I don't know why they would view crypto any differently. And so here's where I'm heading. I would expect them to launch a index-based crypto ETF. And if you're going to do that, then it seems like you would have the standalone spot crypto ETFs as well. So that's part of my thinking. The other part is more just defensive from BlackRock's position, and that, as I mentioned, they're the leader with spot Bitcoin and spot Ether ETFs. Even though Bitcoin's not going anywhere, you would probably mount a strong argument that Ether is looks like the longer term winner of tokenization and stablecoins and all that. We can debate that, but we don't know that for sure, right? It is possible that you have another chain that comes along and maybe they become that. And so if you're BlackRock, why you're basically saying we're already declaring the winners if you're not going to launch any other crypto ETFs. Does that make sense? You're saying it's Bitcoin, Ether, and nothing else. And I don't know that they're in a position to do that. I don't know that anybody's in a position just to definitively make that statement. And so from a defensive standpoint, if I'm thinking about their business, why would you not launch these other spot crypto ETFs in the event they they do continue to catch on with mainstream investors, and maybe more importantly, just catch on in DeFi and all the stuff going on there. So hopefully that makes sense. I still think that they will file for those and launch both of those, but I will say we're getting a little bit late here in the process.
I absolutely agree with you. And I'll add, they added their money market fund, a tokenized money market fund, to multiple blockchains. They started with ETH. They've expanded to Solana and others as well. So they clearly believe in multi-chain world and interoperability. So why not have the ETFs reflect that as well?
Right. And you and I, again, we love the crypto sphere and everything going on here. But if we just peel back to a very basic level, what does BlackRock like to do? They like to make money.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Absolutely.
even if they believe, if let's say they truly think XRP is some sort of scam or Solana is some sort of scam, it's not decentralized, whatever. That's not what they're in the business of determining per se. And so I do think at some point it comes back to that. And we have seen decent demand for futures-based XRP ETFs and Solana ETFs that I mentioned earlier. There's been decent demand there. Most investors, they want to wait for the real thing, but I think there's been enough demand there that would say we should see pretty good demand when the spot XRP and Solana ETFs come to market.
To your point of BlackRock likes to make money, just years ago, they were all in on ESG. Now they're not. Now they're all in on Bitcoin, right? They flipped because they are going to go where they can make money.
Yeah, though I will say I have no doubt crypto's here for way longer
Yes.
than ESG ever had a chance to be.
Absolutely. Nate, always great insights, man. I really appreciate your knowledge and what's happening. And I'm sure we're going to have another conversation very soon
I
within the
don't
next
doubt
three
that.
months.
Yeah,
Yeah.
always appreciate it, Tony. Thank you for having me.
Awesome.